Hello everyone, welcome back. This is Crucible Tarot, and thanks so much for joining for this, I guess, rant or conversation today. I'm going to try to take my time with this. I'm going to try to do this as best as possible because I am using OBS software for the first time for these types of recordings. I would like to talk a little bit about the reasons as to why I have switched over from Aluminum Tarot to Crucible Tarot. And there's quite a bit of insights that I got hit with over the weekend, especially leading up to today. Actually sat in a coffee shop and just kind of thought about my ideas, put them, on some notes. And then after that, decided to share them with you today. So that's what I'll do. We'll go through the order of the day as always. If you like what you see here, please be sure to give a like, share, subscribe, ding the notification bell so that you don't miss updates from future postings. And feel free to support the channel in any way that you would like to, or that you feel comfortable with doing. So that said, I'll get straight into this. This may be a bit of a long one, but I'll do my best to try to stay as, centered and grounded as possible when I speak of these concepts. So I've been thinking a lot about the crucible and speaking about what the crucible is. I chose that as my symbol to try to, to delineate the concept of transmutation, which essentially talks about the process of the soul going through the fire, the trial by fire, a difficult situation in which it becomes stronger and strengthens its relationship to the divine. Now, just going into this, I can talk a little bit about what this means. So when we go through the Cambridge Dictionary, etymology and the definition of the crucible, crux, it comes from the word cross. And of course, you get that in Christian mythology, which is the process in which Christ actually goes from living to dead and then actually risen again. And so these three concepts are actually mirrored within the alchemic process, which I will get to very, very shortly. But what we talk about with Cambridge, their definition of it, it's basically a container in which metals and other substances can be heated to a very high temperature. And this is used oftentimes in chemistry, many, many times throughout the historical ages, going all the way back to antiquity, where people would actually use a bowl. I guess if you want to talk about a bowl, not necessarily this one, but very similar. Usually a stone bowl or something that can withstand the high heat of, the conflagration process, which can then merge or melt different types of metals, create new ones, create new kinds of chemical processes. And this is the first physical definition of it. This is one way that we'll talk about it. The primary way is the severe test. And this has been seen throughout the ages. This is more of the spiritual or the alchemic process that people go through as direct manifestations of the divine, moving through the experiences of life. And so the third definition that Cambridge Dictionary elucidates is basically that it is a place or a situation in which concentrated forces interact to cause or influence change or development. That is precisely the grander scale of the spiritual alchemic process. Looking into these kinds of ways of looking at the crucible, we look at the crucible in a way that refers to the Kabbalah. And this is what I like to look at, Kabbalah with a Q. So there are different ways of spelling Kabbalah, which you have the K, which is the Jewish mysticism. I think it's the Merkaba mysticism version that oftentimes Justin Sledge from Esoterica talks about. And then there's the C, which is the Christian lens of how the Kabbalah is mapped out throughout the 10 spheres of the Sephiroth. And then there is the Kabbalah with the Q, which actually talks about the kind of more New Agey Western esoteric principles that a lot of people look at it, and many times the tarot is involved in that. So what we'll look at briefly, I'll go ahead and pull this up. We look at the different spheres on the tree of life. These are the 10 spheres that are related to this entire process, which we have here. Keter, which is the top one, Chokmah, Binah, Dah, Chesed, Gevurah, and so on and so on. So these different spheres of the tree of life basically show us precisely the relationships that these different lenses or concepts move through in the manifestations of the divine or the divine will. So it goes all the way from Keter, which is the top one, associated with Archangel Metatron, all the way down to Malkuth, which is the manifestation of the material earthly realm, the entire universe as it's seen in the material lens. So without further ado, we'll focus on these different ones here. We'll talk about Gevurah, we'll talk about Chesed, and then we'll talk about Tiferet. Now, in looking at this, we talk about several things that this is related to. Firstly, starting off, we'll look at the different kind of experiences within this physical realm. This is the one that Malkuth oftentimes talks about. So it's the human experience, the manifestation of what they call the homunculus. I think it's like the very small little man, which is the little manifestation of the divine, not necessarily a little man in the sense of like a dwarf or a fetus of some sort, but the homunculus is actually, in the way I see it, it's the way that the universe represents a small manifestation of itself, which equates to the microcosm and its relationship to the macrocosm, which is the totality of the divine. Now, in this human experience, that's where we form the crucible. The human body, the physical realm, is representative of Earth, which is the vessel, this is the bowl in which all things are contained, in which the alchemic process takes place. The soul, the individuation of the soul, and the soul itself, the spark of consciousness in which all things experience life, that is the substance. And the mind and the consciousness is actually where that process takes place. This is the way I have outlined and mapped it in forming Crucible Tarot. This is the way I see it as someone who kind of studies alchemy. And also, this relates quickly to the Kabbalion law of mentalism. So if you've ever picked up the book Kabbalion, it's a very interesting book that talks about the different, or the 7 laws of, the, I guess, the hermetic processes, or the hermetic laws, excuse me. And oftentimes they equate the law of mentalism as that the entirety of the universe is actually a mental process, and the mentality of God is what actually creates the 10 spheres of the tree of life. Additionally, it is responsible for the processes that take place throughout all of existence. And this actually takes place within the human, the homunculus. When we are living our experiences as a direct representation of the divine, what it shows is that we are actually taking this law and concept of mentalism, and we're using that to apply it to our world around us. So that's when the microcosm becomes the magician, that is going from the fool to the magician in, I guess, in Hermetic thinking, and then also how it's related to the tarot as well. Now, the magician, his whole concept, his whole idea is to create his magnum opus. The magnum opus is oftentimes spoken about in lots of different schools of thought, schools of thinking, secret societies, and so on. I know that they mention the magnum opus in Freemasonry, but I'm not really a Freemason at all. I do kind of understand some of the concepts, but not really well read on that. But there are 4 phases of alchemy in which the human experience undergoes the crucible of life. And the first is directed into several different kinds of concepts. I'll go ahead and bring that up as well. So, in this, when we talk about the crucible, if I can bring it up, sorry, one second. There we go. So according to the witches in Druid's Den, we have the 4 stages of the magnum opus. And specifically speaking, we look at different stages. The first stage is what's known as nigredo, and this is blackness, which is representing the process of putrefaction and decomposition. So this is why death is oftentimes the first stage of transformation. And the stage is often associated with the color black. It is characterized by a sense of darkness, chaos, and dissolution. The alchemists must confront and overcome their own darkness and negative aspects in order to move forward in the process of transformation. So they oftentimes refer to this as calcination, which represents the breakdown and the putrefaction of the base material, which is the human experience, the physical living as a spiritual being. And then afterwards, you have the putrefaction, which talks about the decay and the composition in that alchemic process. So this is when we experience negative situations, issues, challenges, things that we're confronted with that we have to process and learn how to overcome. This is the initial spark for that transformative process and procedure. The second phase, it's known as albedo. Albedo literally means whiteness. So nigredo, it's a form of the word black. Albedo, albino, you have different words that are related to that. This is related to the whiteness procedure, which represents the process of purification and enlightenment. So this stage is oftentimes associated with the color white. It's characterized by a sense of clarity, purity, and illumination. So when I was looking at the aluminum tarot part of this tarot channel, I wanted to look at the illumination part, but I think it's important to talk about it as crucible because it talks about the alchemical process that the human experience must go through in order to reach all 4 of these stages. So we then, speak about it where this person says that the alchemist must refine and purify their consciousness in order to gain a deeper understanding of the universe and the nature of reality. So in this process, in this stage of the process, rather, we talk about the solution or the dissolution of the individual, which symbolizes the dissolution of impurities and the emergence of a cleaner, more refined substance. In separation, it also represents isolating the different components of this substance, further purifying the material. So, as this is related to the human experience, we talk about understanding and breaking down each of the different parts of the alchemic, of the experiences that we have, found through this painful, encounter, through this breakup, through this loss of a job, through the initial spark that creates the alchemical process. We then start to look at all of the components that it breaks down into. This is where we get to our analytical self. Why did this happen? Where did this take place? How did I let this happen? What role did I play in all of this? Once we dissolve everything, we can then finally refine our life experiences. That in turn gives us the capability of knowing how to look at all the sum of it, the sum of its parts, looking at all of the different things that have created this situation to begin with. The third stage of the magnum opus is known as citrinius, which is yellowish, which represents the process of transformation and growth. Now, this stage is often associated with the color yellow. It is characterized by a sense of creativity, inspiration, and expansion. The alchemists must integrate their purified consciousness with their material reality in order to bring about the transformation of both themselves and the world around them. So this is the conjunction, which represents the union of opposites and the integration of the purified elements. So after everything is set alight in the crucible, it is broken down into its individual components, separated, refined, and then after that, we can find out how to integrate them. And this is actually another concept in the Kabbalion, which is the I think it's the law of relations. And so additionally, we talk about sublimation, which involves the ascent of the spirit to a higher, more refined state. And this is actually the law of correlation, I believe, in the Kabbalion, law of correlation. Now, when we look at that, we then start to see how things are related, where we can then start to take our life and say, okay, this happened because of this reason. This was the cause and effect of that. This is also another Kabbalion concept, the law of cause and effect. Once we are able to then start to see how things are related, we can then understand that law of cause and effect, which then starts to bring us into the fourth and final stage of the magnum opus. So this is rubedo, which means redness and represents the process of unity and transcendence. This stage is often associated with the color red and is characterized by a sense of wholeness, completion, and transcendence. The alchemist must achieve a state of unity and oneness with the universe in order to achieve the ultimate goal of the philosopher's stone. So this is how the philosopher's stone is created. And we look at it, we go to congelation, which symbolizes the stabilization and the fixation of the purified elements. I think it's cibation or chibation, I'm not sure exactly how to pronounce that, but it represents the continuous input of energy and effort into the transformational process. This then goes to fermentation, symbolizes the final stage of transformation, where the transmuted substance is used to bestow healing and transformation. Exaltation represents the accumulation of the magnum opus. It achieves the substance's most perfect and elevated state. Then we have multiplication, which signifies the enhancement and the multiplication of the spiritual essence's potency. So this is how you can increase and magnify the strength of something. And then projection. This is related to the rubedo stage, where the transmuted substance is used to bring about the desired transformation and transmutation of other substances or individuals. So it's sharing your experience. In essence, it's sharing your experience with other people so that they can start their own transformational, journey. So that's a lot to kind of take in there, but I'll leave some of the information about that into the notes for this lesson, lesson or whatever you want to call it. So that's basically the 4 stages of alchemy. The magnum opus, again, just to be clear, magnum means great, opus means work. So it's the great work that each individual undertakes as a sentient being, united and yoked with the divine, or at least with the experience of the divine, that allows us to finally undergo this alchemic process. That is precisely why we're granted with consciousness to be able to, to be able to go through this journey and finally be able to see the process and the path that is needed to follow from Nigredo all the way to Rubedo. Now, if anyone has actually studied martial arts and you know that there are different colors in the belt process, in the belt system that allows you to go from white to black. This is represented in a similar way to the 4 phases of alchemy. So the black belt is actually the last belt that you need to find, which actually represents the scabbing over. So it goes from white, which will represent like the skin, then to yellow, then to green, then to red, brown, and then black. And there are different and varying degrees of the belt system. But what this in turn does, this is the healing process going from the pure mind, white, going into the different colors of the belt system. Purple is also one of those that goes into it. Once you get to black belt, it is the scabbing over, the healing, the full healing of the individual, which is where you gain a mastery of that specific martial art. So it's a very similar kind of process that goes through the 4 phases of alchemy, and I thought that was kind of interesting to maybe point out. And yeah, it's just something maybe I'll touch on a bit later on. Now, going into Crucible Tarot. So the symbol that is represented in Crucible Tarot, if you look at the symbol that I've included, I didn't actually put it up into this, which I probably should have. We have the symbol, which is the crucible, which is below the big sun kind of symbol that I've got there. And it represents transmuting lead or Saturn into gold, which is sun. And this is throughout alchemy, a process that many people have touched upon. And the way I experience it and the way that I understand it, Saturn is the crucible bowl. That is us. We are the crucible in which this takes place. The consciousness is the place where the procedure takes, where the procedure unfolds. It's kind of like a nuclear reactor, kind of like the crucible bowl. It can be like, any kind of scientific, instrument in which a alchemic process or perhaps maybe a chemical process takes place. Now, with this crucible bowl represented by Saturn, the worldly experiences and the manifestation of matter is represented by lead. We then go into the letter 5, or the V. It's the number 5. It's the letter V, the Roman numeral V, which is in the symbol. And it also talks about the alchemic process of change. This is represented by Gevra. We've had a long kind of conversation about what Gevra represents in Crucible Tarot, and additionally also within the Kabbalah, numerology as well, and the Tree of Life. So we talk about number 5s in the tarot, and we oftentimes see that number 5 in the tarot represents change, transformation, transmutation. And I'll explain a little bit more about this as we go into this. After I explain what kind of procedure takes place with the, with the process itself, then we can have a look at the, the image, and then that will in turn tell us a little bit more about why V is the symbol for change. So, as you know, all number 5s in tarot usually are very difficult to undergo. So you have the 5 of Cups, which represents changing from a negative mindset, focusing on disappointment and sorrow, moving into a happier mindset with the 2 of Cups behind, 3 of Cups in front, 2 behind. That's the number 5 in Cups. You then have the 5 of Wands. That's the part where you are going through the little crucible and you're trying to compete with other people. You're trying to work hard to achieve something. It takes maybe a little bit of argumentation. It takes a little bit of challenges, perseverance, and fortitude in order to get through that process. You then have the 5 of Pentacles, which is the change in one's material circumstances, where you are going from the 4 of Pentacles, where you need to conserve in order for you to save up, to endure some of the difficulties taking place ahead. Then you go into the 5 of Pentacles, which is where you are economically destitute, or you have maybe a low sense of self-worth, where you can actually just go into the church in the traditional right away. You can just enter the church or the cathedral, which represents the sanctuary that is there, as long as you are consciously aware of it. So that part of the crucible, which is you, requires conscious knowledge of your material circumstances in order for you to alleviate that process. And then you have the 5 of Swords. You then go into the part in which the 5 of Swords talks about overcoming a very difficult mental conflict with other people. So because this extra quantity of the different suits is introduced to the 4 is about stability. The 5 then upsets the balance of that and challenges that stability, which then leads to the 6, which then talks about the harmonization of all of those things. I will explain that in more detail as we go along. So, there's a lot to talk about. So, We then go into where this Roman numeral 5 comes about. So this is, because it is change, in the Crucible, it talks about the fire and the heating process, which is represented by the three elements that are used in the Crucible, which are mercury, sulfur, and salt. This may sound a bit strange, but we'll go into some of the alchemic understandings of this. So, number one, we have, let's see if we can find it. I'll bring it back up. So we then again go to the alchemic tree of life. Well, we go to the tree of life. So we have three different spheres: Gevurah, Chesed, Tifereth. So in Gevurah, that is the initiation of the Crucible. This is represented by Mars. That is the ruling planet. The ruling archangel is Samael. It represents Aries, sometimes Scorpio as well. And then it also is represented by the sphere Gevurah, and sulfur is what I believe is the element that this entails. So this triggers the process for alchemic transformation. Sorry, I need to get my words out. Now, when we have sulfur, oftentimes this is related in the burning process. This is why hell is considered to smell of sulfur and things of that nature, because it is the fire, the initiation of this. And because this is Aries, we are then looking into the spark that kicks off all life. So Aries is the first sign of the zodiac. It is also, dare I may say, oftentimes associated with the Fool in the Fool's Journey, the very first card, which is actually 0. And we then talk about how Gevurah represents judgment and strength. And I spoke about this a little bit in detail in the recent kind of rant that I talked about. Because Archangel Samael is the angel of peaceful relationships, this brings tough love to strengthen and empower relationships and enable people to experience inner peace and peace with each other and God. Samael and his angels test people's belief and motivations to determine whether they are wholly grounded and authentic, and to purify them in order to help people build stronger relationships with God. So that is from the Gevurah sphere. This is actually what we'll talk about. And then the next part of this, we then speak about Jupiter, which is Zedekiel, which is associated with Chesed. We talk about this in the sense of Archangel Zedekiel, but also Sagittarius. And I believe that this is related to salt. This is the expansion of consciousness, and this is becoming aware and knowledgeable and wise about the experiences that we've undertaken. So Chesed is, of course, kindness and Mercury, and Archangel Zadkiel is the angel of mercy. He and his angels send the energy of God's mercy to people, inspiring them to be kind to others as God is to them, and to bring them into peace when they pray, so that they may be confident that God will answer their prayers in whichever way that this is best. This, of course, does not mean that their prayers will be answered with what people want or expect, but with what they actually need. And thus they will become to appreciate the fullness in time. So once we undergo that Aries Scorpio situation, we then start to come to Sagittarius, which follows Scorpio, which is where we understand the big picture of what has taken place. And this is important because we'll get into the third part of the fire and heating process, the trinity of the alchemic process, in just a short bit. So these are the first two. Again, it's Gevurah, and then it goes to Chesed, and then the final is the sun. And this is represented by, this is represented by Tifereth, which is the sixth sphere in the Tree of Life. And additionally, this is shared by two archangels, both Archangel Michael and Archangel Raphael. Michael is normally represented by the sun, and that is the one of the co-shared kind of planets for this. Archangel Michael is also represented by Mercury, which is in Hod, which I'll go into that in a later bit. But because we have, for this sphere, beauty, Tiparet, which is the sixth sphere, we're talking about Michael and Raphael. This is the final stage of authentic manifestation. This is seated at the heart of the tree. And the two archangels, Michael on the blue ray and Raphael on the green ray, work together. Michael is the angelic warrior, and he holds steadfast his sword of truth as the angelic leader in spiritual battles, while Archangel Raphael is the chief angel of healing. Together they express the divine energy of beauty, helping people to tap into a higher state of consciousness. Now, I just want to clarify where I received this information from, just that you can have a little bit of that. So there is a website from Catherine Evans. She has blogged about this, and she talks about this in her article about the Tree of Life. So I will include that in the notes for today. So hopefully this can give you a little bit more understanding about what's taking place in the whole alchemic process. Again, 3 stages. We have the first stage, which is Gevura, number 5, and this is ruled by Archangel Samael. We have stage number 2, which is represented by Chesed, which is Archangel Zadkiel, which talks about the weighing process and understanding the deeper meaning behind the situation. And then finally, we have Archangels Michael and Raphael. Raphael is associated with with healing, sorry. And then Archangel Michael is associated with protection of the divine realm, coming back to the sword of truth, the Ace of Swords, which is wielded by all of the different members of the court cards in the air signs. And that is the sword of truth, which then gives us the clarity and the understanding of a situation. And you'll see that many times in the tarot, where you see the Three of Swords, that piercing, that expands the consciousness. That is precisely why Samael is actually a very important role in the alchemic process. He is the third sword. He is the Three of Swords, which breaks the impasse that a person experiences in the Two of Swords. When a person's mind is, shut out of the truth, Archangel Samael is the third sword that pierces the heart and then forces people to go into the Four of Swords, where they are going through that healing process under Zadkiel, where he is talking about looking at the 3 swords, reflecting on that Three of Swords with the Ace of Swords underneath, which in turn gives them the clarity, the understanding, the ability to process, and then to show gratitude for whatever situation they have endured. So I'm hoping this is making sense. I'm already at 33 minutes. I'm going to try to get through as much as I can. But we go into something that I came across not too long ago. I think it was actually today. And it was about the Christ Eagle alchemy, which is a very, very interesting concept that I came across. And I'm going to try to pull that up if it'll work. There we go. Interact. Bear with me a few minutes. So we talk about the alchemic symbolism of the crucified Christ eagle. So we have this website, which is yes. So it is the Alchemy website. It's alchemywebsite.com. I'll go ahead and include more information about that in a later one. Well, at the end of this, actually. So when we look at the alchemic symbols of the crucified Christ eagle, we have this, I think it was like a 15th century German symbol that was located here. And in here we have Christ on the right side, portrayed as the eagle. And the eagle, of course, represents clarity of perception, consciousness, being able to fly high and see the bigger picture of everything. That is an amalgamation of the three concepts of spiritual alchemy, which goes from Samael, being a fierce warrior and protector of people. You have the color black, which represents that process, that part of the process, Negredo. Then you have, with the eagle, you have the clarity of perception, being able to see everything from a high perspective, getting a bird's eye view of the situation under Zadkiel. And then you have, finally, archangels Michael and Raphael, which then talk about the whole process of transmuting all of the negativity and then bringing yourself into an elevated, more refined and purified state. So with this, I just wanted to share just a little bit of this. They do talk about some of the meaning behind this. This is how Christ is actually implied in the alchemic process that each individual represents in many ways. So they say, the Buch der Heiligen Dreifaltigkeit is a complex document. This is where it appears. And it is part of a work of historical prophecy and a part of an alchemic text. The core of its alchemical message lies in drawing a parallel between the Christian idea of the redemption and the alchemical process. We have seen something of this in our discussion of the two hermaphrodites, the luciferic and the alchemical. There's a particular image in the Buch der Heiligen Dreifaltigkeit, that of the crucified Christ eagle, which explains the ideas underlining the alchemical message in the manuscript. I show here the versions in the Munich and the John Rylands manuscript. So John Rylands library is located in Manchester, for those who are interested. It's the famous library in which some of the Harry Potter scenes were filmed, just in case you're interested. But if you go to John Rylands, you'll be able to see this crucified Christ eagle that is portrayed here. So going back to this, here we see a two-headed black-winged eagle set on top or conjoined with the image of Christ crucified. Christ here bears the crown of thorns beneath his golden crown, and we see the stigma on his hands and feet. His belly, which has the blood of the fifth wound, can be seen between the two crowns. In the Munich Codex, there are colored greens and black. His feet rest upon a strange two-headed man without limbs, the left side of his body being green-white, while the right is red. Above the feet of Christ are set two crowns, that on the left being black, while the one on the right is of a silvery color. So I'll jump down to the part where it says, the text details of which one can glean from a book by the scholar Barbara Obrist indicates that Christ, both as a man and as God, is to be identified with quicksilver. Quicksilver contains all of the metals, and these can be given to the names of the seven virtues, and these virtues appear in the crucified Christ. Thus we see seven crowns here set around on by the body of Christ. We saw the opposite with the luciferic androgen, which has seven crowns, but these were associated with the seven deadly sins. The text presents a table of planetary colors and correspondences, and these are the correspondences here. I'll jump down even further. The eagle here is being crucified along with Christ and identifies this with the base metal lead. The text states, all good medicines are brought about by the suffering of God. The eagle was black as he hung on the cross with the seven virtues. But then he ended as a golden eagle in eternal glory. This text also indicates that Christ crucified is symbolized by the black sun being Saturn, and the three-headed eagle hovering above his head, which is called God, the eternal light, the black sun with three necks. We remember that in the Christ mythology, a solar eclipse occurred at the crucifixion. That is the black sun in the Bible. There's more about it. The text set in a semicircle under the crucified Christ states that the trunk of Christ must be constituted of calcinated copper, and that Christ is then transformed by his own power into gold. The mystical suffering of Christ is paralleled with the process of mortification, calcination, and purification. The copper vitriol, his belly, this is oftentimes associated with bile, I believe, must be distilled 7 times so kill this mercury 7 times, always with fresh vitriol, and let it also ascend 7 times. God took the 7th death sentences on his body for us, so that his whole body is dead, bloodied by blows. Now, this is not all, although this is not symbolized in the figure, the text at this point refers to the mythical theme of the 2 liquids, water and blood, which flow from the heart of Christ. That is the alchemic transmutation from water into wine, water being the spirit, wine being the blood of Christ, which the spiritual matter, moves through. So that's pretty much what I'll talk about related to that. But let's carry on. Hopefully I'm making sense here, and hopefully I haven't lost anyone in the process, because I'm losing myself a little bit. Now, we then talk somewhat about how, this Christ ego explanation is kind of a very interesting lens or way of looking at the whole alchemic process as it relates to the Abrahamic faiths, especially that related to Christianity, or Kabbalah with a C. Now, we then can look at the Book of Formation, which is something that I'll get into in a later one, because there's so much to unpack with that book. But this also talks about a lot of the Kabbalistic concepts in which the universe, the divine one, actually manifests itself through the 10 spheres and goes down into, the material realm, which is Malkuth. Now, the last part that I'll speak about, this is something that hit me a little bit today, and I found it to be incredible. I didn't realize it, and I do want to cover way more of this in the future. Now, when we talk about the Crucible, we speak about the creation of the Philosopher's Stone. This is what everyone has tried to do. Many alchemists have tried to look for the Philosopher's Stone, where you can transform base metals into gold. And this is on a very deeply spiritual and profound way of looking at things as it relates to the individual being the manifested base metal, our lead, the whole physical realm, Malkuth, being transmuted into gold through the consciousness. So with Carl Jung and the Philosopher's Stone, he talked about 3 different quotes, which you can Google and, it'll show up pretty easily in like Gemini or something like that. But the 3 that I wanted to point out, well, firstly, he talked about this in his collected works. This is a book that I really need to dive into because there's so much to unpack from this. But he talks about in volume 11, he is quoting 16th century philosopher Gerhard Dorn, which he says, transform yourself into living philosophical stones. There can hardly be any doubt that not a few of these seekers had the dawning knowledge that the secret nature of the stone was man's own self. Again, this really resonated with me very, very deeply in changing the name to Crucible Tarot. So with tarot, what we're trying to do, we're trying to understand our life, we're trying to understand the nature of the universe through the correlations of the planets, through the signs, the zodiac signs, through their relationship as we're laying the cards out and getting that divine consciousness to flow into our own consciousness to receive the understanding and the wisdom of spirit. And that in turn gives us the illumination. So it's not just aluminum tarot, it's something way deeper than that. It's the process in which the crucible takes place. So that way people understand that the Philosopher's Stone lives within yourself. Certainly you can have other ways of looking at it in, the chemistry form of it, where you're looking for a way to turn lead into gold physically, or working with different kind of material sciences. But the main thing that we are trying to do is we're looking at the transmutation of the soul from the base lead into gold, where we are refined, we are purified, and because gold is a holy metal, it is the way that we are able to express ourselves in that way, renewed, restored, and with a deeper sense of faith and understanding. Another one of his quotes is that he talked about in his book, Memories, Dreams, and Reflections. He says, "The stone has no uncertainties, no urge to communicate, and is eternally the same for thousands of years, while I am only a passing phenomenon which bursts into all kinds of emotions." So when Carl Jung speaks about this, he is talking about the stone. It is basically the unchanging, unyielding, immutable macrocosm in which we, the microcosm, also become a stone of sorts. The philosopher's stone dwells within ourselves. The stone representing the fixated energy that is created through the alchemic process. That is the fourth stage. That is the, I believe, let me go back in. Yeah, rubedo, which is the reddening, the final stage. So he's speaking about it in this sense in which he says that, the philosopher's stone is immutable, it's unyielding, and additionally, it allows for us to understand our own nature, which is only a passing phenomenon, which bursts into all kinds of emotions, where we are constantly changing everything in the physical realm, Malkuth. Additionally, within ourselves, is constantly going back and forth, and that is a given, and that is even expressed within the Kabbalion, which they talk about the law. I believe it's the law of change, if I'm not mistaken. I'll get back to you on that one. But it's about the fact that everything in the universe is in constant flux. Everything is in a dialectical process where we are born, we grow, we die, we are putrefied, we then come back, we're born, we die again, we live, we die again. It's that constant material recycling process which allows for us to continue to refine our spirit. Life as it is an alchemic process, a refining of spirit and of consciousness through the body, which is the crucible. I continue to show that as the most important point in the crucible itself. Finally, when we look at it, he mentions one more point from his collected works where he talks about that is precisely why it is so hard to find the lapis. And he says it is exilus, uncomely. It is thrown out into the street or into the dunghill. It is the commonest thing to be picked up anywhere. He's referring to matter in itself. The lapis, the highly regarded understanding of our conscious condition, our relationship with God, the divine. We find it, this is my interpretation of it, in the dung heap of Malkuth. Not to say that Malkuth is bad. Malkuth is kind of the simulation in which all things take place in order for us to, as individual spirits, metrical points within this universe, within this gigantic, this infinite matrix of life. In order for it to have a reference point, it needs to have a simulation, a substrate or a body to encompass that in, and that is precisely what Malkuth does in the 10th sphere. So to wrap things up, what I'll do is I'll just, talk about a few other points that relate to alchemy. So we have many different representations of alchemy and the crucible itself in parts of philosophy, in literature, and things of that nature. For example, the most easiest to look at is Arthur Miller's The Crucible, which talks about the Salem witch trials, in which many people, many women went through the crucible of being proven as a witch or not a witch, but unfortunately in both cases they were killed, which is terrible. But there's a lot to unpack about that. That could be an entire conversation in itself. We have other versions of which is Hegelian or material dialecticism, where you have one thing and then it interacts with another thing, and then it creates a new, kind of element from it. So it's abstract, negative, concrete, as I believe it was George Hegel. I need to remember his first name, but Hegel, the philosopher, talked about Hegelian dialecticism, and then of course Karl Marx spoke about material dialecticism in the way in which all things are constantly in flux. And Karl Marx, if I'm not mistaken, he was Sephardic Jew or of Jewish ethnicity at the time in his epoch. I believe, yeah, it was Germany, if I'm not mistaken, and that may have influenced some of his knowledge about dialectical materialism. So that's one of the things that, again, we could go down a completely different rabbit hole. So again, you talk about material sciences. This is transmuting of materials for practical function, creating of semiconductors, creating of different kind of materials used for building, used for electronics, things of that nature. That's how we get to that refined state and process. There is even, I found, within the Marine Corps, there is something known as the Crucible. It's the final test of the Marine Corps recruits. They have to complete this to earn the title of United States Marine. So in the United States, this is what they do. In this specific camp, they hold this at the Marine Base Corps base camp in Pendleton, California. And it is a massively grueling 54-hour event that pushes recruits to apply the teamwork, endurance, and skills that they develop throughout their training. And it marks the culmination of their journey to become Marines. So even the Marines and many other kind of military again is related to Samael, which talks about Mars, the fire that initiates this procedure to transform. It goes through this process. It marks the culmination of their journey. So that is the alchemic process from becoming a new recruit to becoming a physical Marine. And other societies like Freemasonry, other secret societies, Greek organizations found in the United States and the UK and otherwise, they also use similar processes to initiate their recruits or their new subjects in order to become members of that society. Now, there was one thing I did want to cover lastly about all of this. We have other people like Sir Isaac Newton and Thomas Aquinas. Now, of course, Sir Isaac Newton, he was the one that, discovered a lot of the, Newtonian principles about, gravity and different concepts related to physics as well. But what people don't know is that he dedicated 4 decades of his life to the study of alchemy. And I'll show you briefly some of the symbols and some of his work that you can find here. Now, I hope you can see this. And when we look at it, there is an entire website dedicated to this from Indiana University, Bloomington, which talks about the chemistry of Sir Isaac Newton. And this is where we find a lot of our symbols that are related to the crucible. Newton, he had the use of alchemic symbols, and he had a very creative and unorthodox approach to them. Like most alchemists, he employed the planetary symbols for the known metals and used standard symbols for common substances such as sal ammonica, ammonium chloride, salt of tartar, which is potassium carbonate, vitriol, which we spoke about with the crucifixion of the eagle Christ, iron and copper sulfate. Now, who's Whose metallic correlation is that with? Samael. Iron, copper sulfate, sulfur, again, Samael. And then the strong acids. But in addition to these and other well-known symbols, he created a multitude of additional, more personal pictograms. The easiest of these to decipher are Newton's signs for the ores of the metals. These he represents by taking the standard alchemic symbol and attaching an O to it for ore. With Newton's other symbols, things become much more difficult since he does not decode these for the readers. In general, a horizontal line through the circle may be taken to indicate a salt. Across the top of the circle may indicate an antimonial compound, and the asterisk-like sal ammonica star attached to the symbol may indicate that the chemical in question is very volatile. At present, the editors do not claim to have exact knowledge of these chemicals, reference to which most of the compound symbols correspond. So, there's a lot to go through, but guess what we find here? We look through this, we find different correlations, which then represent a lot of the different astrological symbols in which we get our knowledge of the tarot, of astrology, and so on, which he has incorporated into his works. So not only does he have symbols for Aquarius, he has Pisces, he has Aries here, but he also speaks about, all the way down here, we have our crucible symbol, which is the cross, which is where the root word of crucible comes through. The cross, the 4 elements, the 4 different processes of the alchemic transformation. Negredo, Albino, Citrano, and then afterwards, if I get it right, sorry, Rubado, or Rubedo, which is the red. So this is where you get those 4 elements, those different 4 parts of the process from, and then in the center is the crucible itself, where all of those are joined together and then create something new. So when we look at it in that sense, I'll include this in the list of links as well. And we can talk about, see, there's the sign for vitriol as well, vitriol probable variant. So many insights came today, which I'm really, really happy that they did. And I just wanted to kind of go through the mess that was my mind throughout this weekend in trying to break this down and understand it in something that could somewhat make sense. But I don't know. I guess I'll leave it to you at that. I've spoken nearly an hour about this subject. Holy shit. But it's exciting for me. I do want to go on to more of these kind of subjects. I do really, really love speaking about the occult. Not simply just the tarot. The tarot, esoteric, if we want to look at it, is just one of many ways to express these different concepts and subjects. But I think there's way more for us to learn if we kind of go into the deeper meaning of it. And this is another reason why I've named it Crucible Tarot, is because I want to take it into a deeper meaning where I can break things down into terms of numerology, into astrology, into alchemy, into esotericism, and many, many other different concepts that are related to the occult. So that said, I will be leaving you at that. Thank you so very much for joining. And if you enjoyed this blather, it has taken about an hour, please be sure to give a like, share, subscribe, ding the notification bell so you don't miss any updates from future postings. And additionally, I'll timestamp this so that way you can jump to the different sections of the conversation. Thank you so much for this. And until next time, what do we go? What do we say? Viam, Gevra, Ambula. Walk the path of severity, bravery, and courage. Till next time, take care.